Now let's take a deep dive into some of the HTML code. HTML code looks like this. We can see it first says open bracket div close bracket. We are opening up a new section. Over here we have the title. Title is the Financial Modeling Podcast Infra Advisor Beta, quite a long title. HTML opens spaces like this, whether that's a div, a title, or an image, opens like this, and it closes with / and then the same line, whether that was title, div, image, or h1. For example, here we have a figure, there's everything that's in the figure, and there is the end of the figure. HTML can be complex. Sometimes it has many settings to it. Some of this is imported from the CSS. Let's delve into some of it. For example, over here, I am inserting an image. The source of the image is on a website. The class defines how the image will be displayed to the user. Over here, I've got a heading or h1, a heading 1. The class says that it will be display 7, that's the size, and this uses the CSS code, and it will be bold. This is what the heading will look like. I then found this CSS code from the Bootstrap website for a quote. I quite liked the way this quote looked, so I inserted this code into my one-page website. The quote says the infrastructure sector is about building assets that make our lives better, something I truly believe. The text is within paragraph quotes. There we end the block quote, so it's displayed as a quote, and the caption for the figure, which is in the class block quote footer, is the Financial Modeling Podcast. I was the author of that quote. This CSS code I copy-pasted from Bootstrap and just changed the actual quote and the source title. This is the great thing about HTML. There's so much HTML available on the website, greatly formed HTML, that you don't necessarily need to know everything yourself. You can easily copy-paste what code you need to achieve certain outcomes. There's also more than enough help available. Certainly useful for what is arguably the most widely used programming language. Let's go back to div. The div and span tags, these are called tags in the brackets, are elements used to define certain parts of a document. In this case, I'm defining a certain division. The div tag is usually used as a container for HTML elements, as you can see here. What I like about my IDE is it shows anything that will be displayed to user in white, that is text, and you can see it over here. This is the title, which means it will display as the title for the website in my browser. HTML classes specify one or more class names for an element, and this is used by the CSS and JavaScript to select and access specific elements. In this case, this is all CSS related, or my interior designer, if you remember my previous video. Class names are case sensitive. Different HTML elements can also point to the same class names. So I could have many text classes that use this specific font. These specific parameters are defined in my CSS. I personally don't know CSS. I import the Bootstrap CSS library and use that to define the look and feel of my website, which I think is sufficient for my needs. Let's delve into getting the inputs. First off, you'll notice that this is in dark blue and looks like I'm writing a comment to the person who's reading this HTML file. This is a comment. It is not used or interpreted by the website or the browser at all. It's simply for me to know what this code does. Comments in HTML are written by open bracket, exclamation mark, dash dash, and closed with a dash dash. Now I've got another division. You can see I'm centering it. What I have over here is the title of this division is what type of infrastructure do you want to build? I then have a H4, which is a lower heading class. This will be a smaller heading. And it says, what type of infrastructure do you want to build? Now we want to receive some input from the user. So I have a specific input class. What is the type of my input? Well, it's a radio button. I give it a name, I give it an ID, and I give it the checked value. Now this checked value is what value this will give, the actual ID will give, or the name of this class will give, if roads and borders have been selected. You can see that each of the radio buttons in this specific input has the same name, type of infra. If power plants is selected, when I go and have a look at the checked value of the class type of infra, it will say power plants. If this value said something different to the text, the JavaScript will look at the value over there. So that's quite important to note later on. I've got 3 radio buttons. One says roads and borders, one says power plants, and one says airports. Each of these input class is of type radio. So these are radio buttons. I can only select one of them. And each one has a label. The label for the first radio button is roads and borders. The label for the second radio button is power plants. And the label for the third radio button is airports. Now, notice something quite important over here. I've been really silly. I've used the same code that I used for a previous project. So, the ID of the first radio button is infra type, and the label for infra type is roads and borders. But over here my ID is for 4 people. And this class says for 4 people. That doesn't look right. Well, my ID can be anything it likes. Although it doesn't make a lot of sense, you won't actually see this in the code, and we'll see, well, rather when the website is displayed to the user. It does make sense though to use an ID that is applicable to the specific input class. In this case, I left the ID the same, as long as what I'm trying to describe as the label is the same as the ID over there, this code will work. And this is what it looks like. I've got my title, what type of infrastructure do you want to build? I've got my 3 radios, and they each have a label. This was a second set of code, which is like the first, just for a different section, and then finally one more. What do the buttons look like? Well, this is a button. Over here, this is what a button looks like in HTML. Now, when I click the button, it's calling the JavaScript function called callOpenAI-API. It also passes which button was selected, so I know whether the button was the advice button or the right letter button. The class defines what this button looks like. Within the button, I've got a div section and the text that's displayed to the user. The one button says, give me advice. The other button says, write me a letter requesting funding. When I click on the button that says, give me advice, the function in the JavaScript call OpenAI-API is run, and this is the button that's clicked, which will be advice button rather. And this will be the button that's clicked, which is advice button. If I click this button, it will also run the same function, but this will be equal to write letter. So I know which button has been clicked. You can also see that I have a comment as well. So what does it look like? Well, there we go. There are my 2 buttons. My one button for give me advice, and my other button for write me a letter requesting funding. Now, we'll come to the JavaScript just now, but that information gets passed to the OpenAI API, and the API provides some output back to the user. How do we display that? Well, what's actually happening in the JavaScript we'll see is that I store the output in a variable called result. So all I do is I say infra advisor says, I've got a heading type over there, and a new section, and in that section I put result. also center that text and apply some other CSS stylings to it. Just to show you what the JavaScript function looks like, it stores the result in text format in this result variable.